record on this computer. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Module 3 discussion. I am Kelly, and I have with me Sandra.
Hi, I'm Sandra.
And I'm Kamara. Hi.
And this week, we're going to be talking about Dewey and Weick from our discussion 1. So first up, in what ways is Dewey writing in the 1930s relevant to educational contexts of today? And are they relevant for our work specifically? So I'll kind of get us started off with talking about Dewey. I was talking to Sandra and Kamara just a bit before we started recording. I encountered Dewey a lot in my Master of Education program, and I really loved his approach in the classroom, not necessarily things that we read this week, but about apprenticeship. And this week it was more about experience. And so he really goes into experience and how that plays into learning. And I think his whole definition of what traditional education is versus progressive education is very interesting. He brings up the idea of autocracy and democracy, and that traditional education is very autocratic, and that progressive education is very democratic. I still feel like today in our classrooms, like in K-12 space particularly, it's still very autocratic. I think in my specific use case where I was in a makerspace, and I was a strong advocate of project-based learning. And I learned a lot about transdisciplinary teaching, and I feel like Dewey was like right there. And so, but it was back in the 1930s. So I just find, like, for me personally, when I was in K-12 space, there was a disconnect where I didn't see it. I still feel like there was more traditional education that was going on. In particular, on the traditional education, there was one quote that really stood out to me in the article where he talked about, in traditional education, he said there was no demand that the teacher should become intimately acquainted with the conditions of the local community, physical, historical, economical, occupational, etc., in order to utilize them as educational resources. And it said, and then he says, a system of education based upon the necessary connection of education with experience must, on the contrary, if faithful to its principle, take these things constantly into account. So he's saying, like, his critical experience in education should take into account all those things. And again, for me, that's project-based learning. Like, transdisciplinary teaching and project-based learning all talks about real world problems, local context in your community, and the teacher does need to know those things. So I love that approach. Also in the makerspace and with what I do with Teacher PD, I'm a real, like, hands-on person. I'm all about, like, hands-on active activities, and I think that lends to the whole experience viewpoint as well. So yeah, for me personally, it really resonated, and I particularly loved it. So what do y'all think?
Yeah, I was really, oh, Sandra, you want to go first?
Go.
Kelly, I walked away. I kept looking at the date on Dewey, right? 1938. And I literally was left with a question in my mind, like, have we even progressed from when he was writing? Like, I feel like you could take his definition of traditional and progressive education, and it could have been a contemporary article. So I was reflecting on it in that same thing in my own space. So I am in the medical school arena. So when you talk about, democratic versus autocratic and the place of power in the classroom, it's really, really interesting in terms of curriculum redesign and how that education is done. I mean, for about 115 years, med ed was taught in the exact same way. And it was only about 10 or 15 years ago that they started to look at how are we engaging the learner. And so there were two things that they did that I think get a little closer to Dewey's thoughts on how do you integrate experience because, I mean, it was just completely lecture based, right? It was some doctor that came in or some basic scientist that came in, told you all the disease states, how to apply it to, probably a white male because there were no other, individuals in the test cases, and away you went. And so interestingly enough, they started by doing flipped classroom. And then they switched up where in the first 2 years, the med students would start to go into the clinical setting, because what happened is med school is a 4-year experience. In the first 2 years, they wouldn't even go into the clinical setting. And so that was like their first foray into maybe getting a little closer to this progressive education and integrating experience. At the Medical College of Wisconsin, we're currently in another curriculum redesign. And Kelly, I think we're getting a little closer now to what you were talking about in the K-12 space, which is, you know, closer to this case-based learning, and how do we actually bring patients in? And then how do you have students actually wrestle with the patients? And then, you know, they've got like sim centers and things like that, where they're starting to actually simulate some of these things happening, I think, to really bring this experience alive. What I'm left wondering, both in the K-12 space and in the higher ed space where I am, is how are we integrating who the students are, right? So Dewey talks about just even the context of the learner themselves and how that needs to be integrated. And that's where I think I'm still left wondering if we've made much progress. So Sandra?
I think that's a really great segue to the, I have so many little points that I want to make as well. I think this was my favorite reading so far this week anyways. And I think in general, because I feel very strongly about this contrast. And I mean, a lot, I read I read chapters 1 and 2 because I just wanted the context, because I've never read Dewey. And this idea of, you know, it's not either or, and it's not sufficient to just say traditional education sucks and let's just the opposite of, because that in and of itself brings up its own other set of issues. But for me, what brings to mind is I took a teaching seminar, I think like during the pandemic, and it was about deeper learning. And so his traditional versus progressive education really brings to my mind this deeper learning aspect, that this isn't about surface recall. This is about really understanding concepts in a way that attach to you. And I think you both have already identified 2 different high impact teaching practices, right? Whether it's project-based learning or problem-based learning, flipped classrooms or flipped, you know, like that whole approach. For me, we do a lot of PBL as well, and academic service learning, where it's about relevance, right? So his concepts about continuity and interaction, I thought was really strong, because what I want to focus on is first time in college students that are coming from underserved, you know, the majority of them are coming from underserved backgrounds. And so they're coming in at a very critical transition point in their education, and they're coming in with experiences that they've already, this kind of meshes a little bit with the time scales, but that one hurts my brain. This idea of you're coming in as an 18-year-old with 18 years of learning patterns, some from home and some from school. And if those 18 years, you know, bring with you, or, you know, influence the way you're looking at yourself, your love or hate of learning, that whole continuity of learning experiences impacts where you are that first semester at college. So what are we doing to help support the learners who come in, and the whole interaction of how do you make meaning with the context that you bring, and how do we make this learning relevant to you so that it sticks better, right? So I think that it's a really great question, because when we talk about, I loved what they were saying about this idea of miseducative. I'm not going to pronounce it right, but he was talking about, you know, are all experiences something to be learned from? And he says yes, but you could also learn the wrong things. You know, you could learn in such a way that it actually detracts from your ability to learn in the future. And I really think that that's what I get to see, sadly, in this transitional period, when students come and we're not helping them make the adjustment to thinking more divergently as opposed to convergently. When they get, you know, we're being taught rote memorization, repeat, you know, rinse and repeat, as opposed to now open your brains and think differently and explore the context. And if we're not helping students go through that experience, personalize it with their own assets, then they're going to feel failure. And his whole notion of failure can breed the wrong kind of attitudes towards learning that can be detrimental. I think is really important. So anyways.
No, that part was actually really strong to me too. And there was that section right there where you're talking about, where he said that how many of us have gone to school for X amount of years, and then so many years later we're like, where does this even apply, like, to whatever? And that's exactly what you're talking about. And I feel like that approach and what he was saying was a call out, not just to an educator, but also like an educator's approach, you know, because it's not putting the blame on the student. It's not saying that the student didn't learn it. The student passed the test. So I completely agree with you. And one of the quotes that was in there, I put it on my Twitter today because I loved it so much, and it's a short one, but it's the most important attitude that can be formed is that of desire to go on learning. And like, that's like his, you know what I mean? Like for me, it was, so yeah. And I agree with you, Kamar, when you were saying like 1930, when the first time I ever read him, again, several years ago in my other program, I was like, this is 1930. Like it just didn't, it seemed really odd to me. I ended up buying like his book. I have not read it. It's still on a shelf somewhere, but I have every intention to do so.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's really,
It
really
was really
interesting.
engaging.
Yeah.
I want to add like a personal note, like when my son was young and we were thinking about what school to put him in, I took this really big risk. I'm usually like I don't like to break rules. I'm like very nervous about taking risks and whatnot. But I made the decision to not put him in regular school. I put him in a Waldorf school, which is an alternative approach. And the biggest draw for me was the whole love of learning. Like I didn't need him to, but it was terrifying I literally was like white knuckled for the first 4 years, 5, 6 years. Cause I was like, I don't know if he's reading yet, because he wasn't reading like the way everybody else was reading. And he wasn't doing math the way everybody else was doing math, but it was all curiosity based. And it was fascinating and terrifying all at the same time. I was running like my own summer school camps by myself, like slipping like these worksheets to him just to see if I could test, like, what do you know? Because there's no grades, no assessment. But it was a great risk. It was a great gamble because he just naturally, high school was boring to him as a result of that. And I think college is much more in tune with that kind of learning for him now. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, it makes me think about our experience in the doctoral program. Like, why did we choose to keep doing this, right?
Right.
That desire for lifelong learning is really interesting. I don't know if we have time to transition yet to the small wins, or if we've exhausted our time.
No, we actually have a few more minutes. So I am going to our next question up is, what about Weick writing in the 1980s? And are his suggestions still significant for you as a scholarly practitioner trying to affect change in your local context? So I'll start off with just saying what I had to say about Weick and just reading the whole thing. I got really hung up. This is my muddy point. That's part of my reflection journal on the Alinsky example paragraph of a polluter. Like I just didn't even understand what it was saying at all, because it was talking about like a banking process. And I'm like, what does this have to do with pollution? I went and looked it up and I asked friends, is how I ended up solving like the whole mystery. And it made more sense to me now, but that's why it was tied to the 1980s, because banking in the 1980s was all paper. And so doing that process, and it was actual pollution, because I'm thinking to myself, is this like political pollution? Like, what does this even mean? But Alinsky, I guess, wrote this whole like rules for radicals, and it was all about like impacting social change and how to do it in these really radical ways. So yeah, I don't have much more to contribute other than that. That was like my takeaway. The three like approaches that Alinsky had: small, recognizable, I don't remember the other one, but that was very clear, like what they were getting at, I think, in terms of that. And I think that going back to our reading in the leadership change class we had, where it was not just like the motivate the elephant, but it was also talking about the same thing, like SMART goals. And so I do think it definitely has context and like how we approach that.
Yeah, I think this piece really resonated with me. I've been having it. So my background is organizational development and design and human resources, and that's how I've grown up in the world. And I have these moments sometimes when we're reading through these theories where I go, oh, that's why this worked, because someone actually proved that it worked. And I think in the med school space, for me, it's always been all about small wins. Every new person that's come on my team as a leader, I've oriented them and said, listen, this is going to be small. It's going to be iterative. If you want your change to get accepted here, you're going to have to take it one step at a time. And if your idea doesn't get accepted today, hang on to the folder. This was back when we had like real folders. Now it's digital folders, right? It's because the moment will come when that idea's time will be ready and you need to pull it out, which goes to sort of this opportunistic sense of it. So I was really drawn, I think, to this and could really resonate with it in my own experience. And it was a good reminder for me, I'm looking to advance flourishing in the practice of medicine. And I think that there are a lot of physicians that don't want to admit that they need it. And so it was a really good reminder for me that small wins bring psychological safety. I really appreciated that point. That allows people to enter into your idea instead of being so overwhelmed by the big concept. So that's really what I think I'm taking away this week from that.
Yeah, I think, Tamara, like you know, not having grown up in the strict education space, my background experience has been like in these large scale distributed networks, right? So you've got, 400 affiliates in one experience. I had like 9 affiliates, now I have 8 campuses. And so nothing big will ever happen without like top leadership. And even when the top leadership is identified, something like in this case, change making initiative, it wasn't going to be like, let's beat everyone over the head and make everyone have to do this all the time. And so it's very strategic, I think, to think small. It's very strategic and it's not easy, but I loved a lot of the characteristics. For me, this is the only way I can work. I know how to work. It's how I feel like I tell students, I feel like what I do is I start tapping into concrete walls and I start making cracks. And I love, like when they were saying one of the characteristics is that it's not linear, that these are like cracks that are going in a specific direction or some catastrophic situation that you want to get away from. And I really think I love the opportunistic thing. That's probably the number one word that I would say. I'm constantly looking for how I can get my foot in the door. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, you do. Yes, let's talk about this. And so
yes, I have an idea.
And I have the same ideas folder, the real one. Like that's so funny that you mentioned that, because I have the same concept. And I tell my staff the same thing, although now it's an electronic folder. But I would say, like, for my work, even the innovation that I'm hoping to bring forward for me in our dissertation and our action research is one of those small wins. It doesn't feel small in terms of right now the scope of like putting the IRB together and doing the actual work, but in the grand scheme, that is a small win if I can get that innovation to work. So to me, it's very relevant to the work that I'm doing.
Awesome. And I just realized I started our timer slightly late, so we probably went a couple minutes over, but I think we're good. So that was fantastic. I think we kind of got all of our points out. And so I hope everybody has a great week, and we will see you in the next module. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.